Hi, I'm Renee Williams,
And I'm Billy Thomas.
and welcome to the first edition 2026 of From the Woods
Happy New Year!
Today. Happy New Year, everyone. We thank you so much for joining us. Again, you are always the reason why we're doing this, and we've started out strong in a new year.
Yeah, really glad to have you all with us and hope you all had a great break with family and friends and you're energized for the new year. I know we are really excited here at Forestry Extension to get started in 26 and we're happy to have you all with us. We're going to start with a great show today. We've got two outstanding presenters. We've
Yes,
got Dr. Matt Springer who's going to be talking about the impact of forestry practices on wildlife, which is really important, Renee, because many of our landowners care about their forest from a wildlife standpoint, right?
they
So
do.
if we can kind of double dip and help our woods and help the wildlife, we both win. And we can do that if we do it right. So we'll look forward to hearing from Dr. Springer on that. And then we have our always excellent Dr. Ellen Crocker, our forest health specialist. She's going to be talking about a pesky plant. This is one that could be a real booger, really hard to get rid of, and can cause some real challenges. So we'll look forward to hearing from Dr. Crocker on that. But again, we're glad to have you all with us. If you have any questions for our presenters, please use the chat function if you're with us live on Zoom. And if you're a podcast listener or a YouTube viewer, thank you very much. But you can hit us up via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu and we can respond that way. But Renee, really excited to get 26 rolling with you.
Exactly. So let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Springer, welcome to the show. Really appreciate you doing this for us. I know it's a question that we get a lot, and so I thought, hey, first show, let's start out strong with
Yep.
Dr. Springer so he can tell us all about this.
Sure, yeah, it's one I get on a pretty regular basis when I give talks, especially when I'm talking about wildlife habitat management, and whether it's from folks that are trying to improve wildlife for things like songbirds or even herps to folks that are really concerned about like messing up their hunting season by having a logging job done in their forest right as deer season's starting, and
Right.
so it's one of those where people want to know, it has an interest, and it's a pretty straightforward answer in certain situations. And then, yeah, there's always nuances in everything that we do in natural resources. So,
Right.
but I guess I'll pull up
Go
my
ahead.
my talk here, and we'll get things rolling. I will say, given the new year, I was feeling a little sentimental and wanted to start the year off right, and pulled up an Aldo Leopold quote and an image of the shack and everything else. And I just kind of was like, oh, I got to start it with some Aldo.
Yeah,
But
that's
with
good.
that said, I hope you all have enough time to read the little blurb there. I always started my wildlife classes off with a little Aldo, so we'll go with that today too. Um, so grand scheme here, talking about forestry and forestry impacts on wildlife, right? What it kind of boils down to, and I'm going to try to take the simple approach first here, is when we think about forestry, forestry really just involves an active management of vegetation, right? In some way, shape, or form. It could be things like removing trees. It could be removing invasive species that we're about to hear about after I'm done talking. It could just be trying to shape the composition or structure of the vegetation that exists in your woods. And we have a lot of species in the state of Kentucky and the East that are really reliant on that vegetation in some way or another for various life stages or survival components. So anytime you're doing something related to that vegetation, such as forestry, you are going to impact wildlife. Straight up, nothing there that like it's that straightforward, right? The impact itself, though, is going to kind of depend on what you're doing to the forest. If you're doing a clear cut, if you're doing invasive species management, usually invasive species management is a beneficial act. But there are a lot of species, especially certain bird species, that use that structure that exists from those invasives, whether that's honeysuckle or buckthorn or um, multiflora rose. They're using that to help them. So if you get rid of that invasive, you may actually short term have a negative impact, long term big benefit. So it kind of just depends. That's that nuance part. But when we think about what wildlife are using forests for, it generally comes down to like all these major structures of management for wildlife. It's food, it's cover, it's nesting habitat, it's brooding habitat, it's hibernation areas, it's daytime resting sites, it's trying to shelter from a blizzard. It's, all kinds of things. And, they It almost always is species specific. It can be things like guilds or groups of birds that have very similar behaviors. It can be, close relatives like a lot of squirrels, like a fox squirrel and a gray squirrel, are going to be pretty similarly impacted by forest management. So it can be groups of species have similar reactions, but almost always when you talk about forest management and actively managing that forest, it's going to be a species specific outcome based on what you're doing in that tract of land. And part of that impact is going to kind of depend on whether that animal, that species is using that area for a very short period of time, long, a season, a nesting season, a winter grounds. So, that natural history component of that species plays a role in the impact of that forestry practice. And those even a short duration practice or a short duration species of presence, the practice itself can have a major impact on that species survival, especially for those species that are going through long movements like migration. Having a healthy forest patch, even for a day or two that they use it, can provide a lot of food that can help them actually have a major benefit as they go through that entire cycle that they're experiencing. So that timeline is important, but it's also not necessarily important to all species in the same way. Um, and where we talk about forestry and the big thing that we push here, right, in our extension team is you want to have a forest management plan. And those plans are going to be geared towards your individual goals for your forest and the property itself. Those goals are often going to relate to either economic outcomes, forest health outcomes, or they can be for wildlife and recreation outcomes. As a landowner, you're the one that kind of sets that. And even within public property, there's guidelines that exist for how that property is managed, right? There's a plan in place for the management of that property. Looking at and knowing what you have in your forest and what your neighbors have in the forest are all going to kind of tell you and guide someone, whoever is writing that plan, to meet those goals and whether those goals are realistic or not. And within wildlife, often those plans are going to focus on those components that the species that you want to see need: the cover, the food or reproductive needs or resting site needs. And your plan is going to be geared towards that. And the forestry practices that you try to put in place are going to look at responding to those needs, whether that's things like food and the responses of that food, right? So it can be things like plant and tree material itself. It can be trying to increase species that produce mast, whether that be soft mast or hard mast, right? So soft mast production species are going to be, you need more light generally to get those, where hard mast, you don't necessarily need a lot of light on the ground floor if you're doing things like trying to promote an oak from its competition and doing just a crop tree release. There's trying to increase the insect life that exists, where you may want to diversify your undergrowth and have a lot more species present versus having a kind of more of a monotypical stand of maybe just oak trees, which oak trees are really great for insects. But if you're in a beech maple forest, then you have less insects that are going to use that than, say, an oak stand with a lot of diverse understory. Um, and then like food in general, like if you create the right habitat, you're going to create a food web, and everything kind of works together and all to kind of move energy through that system. From the cover side of things, we are looking at within the species what kind of cover do they need, and what cover is in general. The actual definition of wildlife cover is any element in the system, in the landscape, that reduces energy usage. So that can be either helping them be protected from thermal issues, weather related, or it can be related to trying to, so they don't have to constantly be avoiding predation or some other, competitor in some way or another. So what that looks like in terms of animal behaviors are things like escape or concealment cover, reproductive cover for nesting habitat or brood rearing, resting and loafing areas. This is something that turkeys need often. Like they don't just constantly walk around the landscape. That would be burning calories a lot. They need to find an area that they can kind of do a dust bath and relax and not have to move around a lot. roosting sites, whether that be for a bird or a bat, travel corridors that you linking two quality habitat patches with something that doesn't put them out in the wide open. Winter cover, right? So a lot of these also have a seasonal context, whether that be related to temperature extremes or weather extremes. Right? We have potential for ice storms or blizzards, snowstorms to the other side where you have potentially heat waves. So you need to make sure that there's a little bit of cover that meets that thermal component in an area. And then there's just, feeding cover, which is, something that do you have the structure in place where there's food that also provides concealment for them to lower predation risk or provide thermal elements that help keep them alive while they are out feeding in extreme weather conditions? So all that kind of plays its role in cover. And usually, though, we kind of think of that as a vegetation only kind of thing. And in Kentucky, most of the vegetation cover is, for us, it's really thick. It's someplace that you would not want to walk through and for many species. It's high stem density, lots of leaves, lots of branches, really producing so that you can't, a structure that you can't see through. But for some species, it can mean things like snags, right? Dead trees that are standing, really important for bats and woodpeckers, for example. It can be down logs, it can be rocky outcroppings. So all of that kind of plays a role, and we have practices in forestry that help create all of these elements minus the rocky outcroppings. It's really hard to make a tree grow rocks. We can't do that. But we can potentially bring rocks in to create one. Um, so all of this kind of plays a role in forestry, right? There's elements in a forest management plan that can manipulate our forest to start doing things that create certain elements. And all of that kind of plays off this idea of using plant succession to our advantage. Okay. And what succession is the known kind of path that plant communities take from the start of a bare rock, nothing growing to the end community of what happens as competition plays out and sunlight plays out, who can colonize an area first and how fast they grow, and then how do they compete with each other. That predictability of communities and how it goes in time is plant succession. And we know that, if you look at here from left to right, we have grasses and weeds and forbs are generally our first kind of plants that start growing in an area that doesn't have anything other than dirt, and then eventually gets to a climatic forest element, whether that's beech or maple, depending on where you are. But for us, it's a lot of times in upland systems, it's oak and hickory currently. So that entire, trend there in time is what we're looking at as either a forester or a wildlife biologist of how do you maneuver those elements to meet certain forest structure and plants and composition. And from the wildlife side, our species that we're concerned about or that we're trying to promote have these requirements that usually exist somewhere along that regeneration succession timeline. If you're a younger species, you're going to favor earlier succession components or early seral stages. Things like the grassy, brushy stage, where you don't need giant oak trees that have no understory underneath them, because you need to survive like a rabbit or a brown thrasher that needs to have that really thick vegetation to both nest in and fly around and to stay safe. And often we have situations where we have species that actually need multiple different types of those stages to meet their natural history requirements, their survival requirements, their food requirements, and cover requirements. So we tend to not think of just creating a uniform system, but we want to have multiple successional stages along the way. And to create multiple successional stages, right, we're not starting off with no dirt or, everything we kind of have now in almost 99.9% of the situations is not starting from scratch. It has vegetation on it in some way, shape, or form. So we are actually operating under this idea of secondary succession, where there's a disturbance event that plays a role in resetting the system. And if we think about what disturbance events exist and how they can play a role in setting that back, We hear about big ones, right? Especially in West, if we think about Western systems in North America, forest fire and an extreme forest fire is a really hard reset to the system. But we don't often have those in the East. So what do those look like here? Well, here they can be either natural disturbance events like wildland fires that spark from a lightning strike, or they can be things like wind and ice storms, flooding, pest outbreaks. All of those can kind of provide some disturbance to the system that kills that plant community at either any stage and causes a reset. It can cause a complete reset if it wipes it out completely, right? You have a pine beetle comes through in a pine stand, that entire stand's dead. That's a little bit harder to reset than going in there and doing something like a logging or timber harvest, which would set systems back to a certain extent, even whether that be at a stand level or at a smaller component of a stand, right? So this doesn't have to be the entire forest gets reset. It can be a tenth of an acre gets a reset where you get light that hits the floor and you get different vegetation growing in that component. Other ways we can do this are using things like timber stand improvement or forest stand improvement techniques that we're going to talk about a little bit more. We can use prescribed fire as a way of setting back systems, or we can try to incorporate native grass plantings to increase competition. You can do underplantings of tree species in systems where the natural regen and process where you have tulip poplars are in there, you can try to speed that along where an oak tree may not occur yet for another 100 to 200 years in the cycle. You can try to do plantings that speed that process up. So we have multiple different ways and management practices to kind of reset this. And often they're going to involve some kind of major disturbance event like logging or herbicide or fire that kind of moves things back. And this is where, if we're talking about grassland management, we often are using herbicide and fire to kind of at a 3 to 5 year interval to right when shrubs start coming in to hit the reset button and make sure it's just grasses and forbs. Forests, it's a little bit longer of a cycle, right? And why we do this is kind of twofold. Many of these disturbances kind of do meet multiple goals, right? So I talked about like that food and cover, brooding habitat, and everything else. And if we look at things, here's another kind of stage as we move through and up top here, but more importantly on the bottom side, and we look at just beginning to end, that 200 plus year cycle, there's food and cover that gets met a lot more for a wider array and larger number of species on that 1 to 20 year side than from the 25 plus to 150-year-old side. Just because you have a lot more species generally present within that first 10 to 20 years of the successional stage. And the structures there, they're still kind of all having it out with each other to see who's going to win out. And it's a lot closer to the ground. So all of our terrestrial species tend to be able to take advantage of both the cover that it creates close to the ground, as there's a lot of stem density, but also for species that eat plants, it makes a lot of food available at a level they can reach it. So when we think about things like deer and elk and bear, rabbits, the forage quantity and quality tends to be much higher on that 1 to 10 year side than later on. And if you look at that curve, there's a pretty good fall off, and that kind of comes up again. And that increase is related to the mass production that occurs later on in those old growth forests. As well as you sometimes have some gaps that occur when trees fall, and it kind of produces a flush on the ground. So when we think about forests in Kentucky and the disturbances we need to create habitat and forestry in general, logging is actually probably our most productive tool at scale to create new habitat for wildlife and hit a reset button for our forests. Um, it, we had a lot of disturbance going on in our forests prior to European colonization. A lot of that was either associated with fire or use by the indigenous folks that were living here, the first people. But we have this need to replace that at scale, right? We have really a lack of early successional habitat in our state. If you drive around and look at the forest, almost all of it kind of looks about the same age. It's closer to that 100-year component, right? Not necessarily in that 0 to 20-year component. And you have an economic link there that allows folks to do things across many acres at a time when you have a lot of chainsaws and a lot of equipment that can get out there because there's a economic link that allows people to be employed and have outcomes that are both economically beneficial and if done correctly, and you're following the BMPs that exist with logging, that have a huge benefit to wildlife as well. If we were just wildlife biologists trying to go out and create habitat for wildlife, we would not be able to make it at scale that would have any meaningful impact for a lot of species that are in decline in the early successional side. So I'm going to bring this up as logging is a wonderful disturbance tool when done correctly and following all the rules and regulations and BMPs. It allows us to do things at a really large scale. Um, and, because of that, a lot of our forest management plans have these silvicultural prescriptions that incorporate other disturbance events, right? But usually are going to try to incorporate logging into them because it allows things to happen at a much larger impact, right? More acres can be impacted. As someone that's gone out and done FSI on acreage, you can only do so much in a day. I'm only so fast and I'm getting older and slower. So you can only do so much. You can get a lot more done with heavy equipment and moving things out and with folks that are motivated economically. So if you look at, here's a picture that's pretty common view of forests in Kentucky. And if you could do multiple things to the stand, right, depending on what your goals are and what the economic situation is and everything else. And what that relates to, right, is multiple prescriptions. And I kind of want to run through some of them right now and talk about their potential impacts to wildlife as we go into details. So here's a stand. The one that I've already talked about in terms of habitat and forests that we need is creating early successional habitat. And how you do that, right? So you have basically the climax component of a forest system. How do you reset it to almost the beginning to get that early successional habitat? Well, you remove a lot of those trees that are blocking the light from hitting the ground and kind of let that light hit the ground. You will get that burst of new trees and shrubs and sometimes grasses and forbs that are all kind of in that seed bank. And we kind of look at that as that's an extreme reset, right? So this is what traditionally or previously was called clear cuts. It could be called a regeneration cut. It could be called a patch cut. All it's really doing is taking a lot of the overstory and saying we want to get rid of basically all of it. Now, I'm not saying all of it necessarily, but you almost want to have 90% of that area is going to have full sun hitting the ground. That's a hard reset in the forest world. That event, though it's not looking very appealing, in a year or two provides amazing wildlife habitat. And it benefits a lot of species that really don't have that present in the landscape right now. And I'm going to kind of work through kind of various levels of impact here with forestry and the components in terms of scripts for silviculture and how a forester or a logger may approach a stand. So the next one would be kind of a shelter wood harvest, where you can see that there's a lot more trees left standing. And that means less light to the floor, more kind of structure still up there. There's still some production of acorns going on in stands and other mast. There's ability to host some canopy level species still, and certain species like cerulean warblers are going to prefer these open habitats if you have the right size trees left. It's there to kind of hit a reset on the ground, right? You're going to have maybe 30% coverage of the ground from the sun, so you still have a lot of sun hitting the ground. You'll get a burst of growth in a year or two, and it's going to progress slightly different in terms of forest structure and composition than the regeneration cut, depending on the local site. But it's going to be closer to the regeneration cut than, say, the next one here, which is either a selective harvest or a mid-story removal, where you have a lot of canopy that's still left up there. And, it's going to provide a lot of shading. So you're going to have a little bit more shade tolerant species regenerating in certain situations rather than, those that are going to take advantage of that full light. You're going to see less shrubs responding, less forbs responding because they need more light than the trees do. So this is kind of like and this is even the lower extreme. You can get down to where you're really selectively harvesting individual trees to get them out of the woods, whether that's for economic benefit. Um, but this is kind of from the wildlife side, um, extreme disturbance in forestry that's going to do kind of work a reset and get a very different vegetative community to a slight disturbance. And there's nothing wrong with it. You're just going to have different benefits for species along the way. So those management plans and what you're managing for are really going to drive what it needs to be done on your habitat. If all done correctly, logging, herbicide, or whatever, there's really a benefit for wildlife species no matter what. Habitat is neither created nor destroyed, it just kind of changes form. So it's always going to be habitat for something. It's just, is it the thing that you want? Um, and every situation is unique, right? You have the history of the sites, the vegetation that's existing in the sites, the invasive species that are present. All of that's going to kind of play a role, and may change your outcome. And that's where having a professional forester involved and having a wildlife biologist involved is really going to help guide your individual specific needs of the situation. And they're going to look at what's there, they're going to look at what's going on and what you need, and they're going to think about what you need based on the species that you have, think about structure that's left, the composition that's left, think about how they're going to create either the canopy, the mid-story, the understory, or the shrub layer, or even the forest floor, and how to make what you have turn into what you need. And that's kind of how it goes. And they're going to always kind of have this in mind, right? So these specific successional stages and creating them and making them occur. You have details that exist, and reality being certain things like early successional forest habitat is going to create more soft mass than later successional habitat. That's going to benefit different deer or different species than a mid-story. So if you think about the stages, right, we have early succession is going to have certain species that benefit. Our intermediate forest, which is a little common one in our state, this is going to have that mix. It's going to have a little bit of the understory, the mid-story shrub layer, and the canopy. It's If you had to manage for one thing, this is going to be the one that catches a little bit of everything. But it's also what we have a lot of in the landscape right now. It doesn't, this is going to continue to progress. It progresses through succession at a slower rate than, say, the early successional stages, but it's eventually going to get to the climax stage, and you're going to lose that understory. Um, it, it's not necessarily, it's great. It's usually the prettiest one in terms of the culturally what we accept, but it's not necessarily the best thing to have as your entire forest. And knowing what your neighbors have can really impact what you may want on your stand and on your property to meet your goals. So if your neighbors have a really pretty stand and you want to have deer on your property, you may want to clear cut a giant chunk of it to create bedding area, because the deer are not going to really bed in that in a lot of situations, especially during fall and winter when those leaves fall away and you can see a really long way in the landscape. You can keep this stage longer through things like selective harvesting and selective logging. So you can kind of keep it there, but it's eventually going to progress if you don't have some small scale disturbance mechanism occurring. If you let it go, you get to those mature stands. They're indicative of, you look, big trees, really big trees, tend to not have very much going on the ground level. There are a lot of species that people are very fond of that benefit heavily from having this. I mentioned the cerulean warblers, which are pictured there. They do use these stands and generally in combination with other features. But these stands are going to have the largest mass producing trees, so you get a lot of things, acorns, hickory nuts, that are going to benefit, especially mammals that can consume them. It's also going to benefit things like woodpeckers that need areas to create big cavities. So there's a lot there in terms of what it still brings to the table, but you don't necessarily want to have nothing but this, right? So that's kind of my point, is the forestry side is having those disturbances allow you to create the components you need to help a lot of species. Having a solid stand, be your only forest, it all looks the same, not so great. Other forestry practices that really kind of, right, so we're trying to increase food. There's a lot of ways of doing that. right? You can let things progress as they are, but a lot of our practices, though they are vegetative based, may have a goal of just increasing food for wildlife. Um, the way you can do that is it can be related to actually managing the forest itself, by taking trees in out and doing forest stand improvement. It can also be by creating a small disturbance like burning off a layer of leaves on the ground that allow new sprouts to come up and get those nutrients back into the soil, so you get more transfer of nutrients through the system. It can be a lot of things. Even planting them to increase it, right? So if you want to try to do more hard mats, you would have silvicultural practices that can kind of do maneuver the vegetative community, things like timber stand improvement, removing invasives, logging, all kind of can move things forward. The soft mass side really is going to be heavily reliant on either creating gaps in the canopy that allow sunlight to come down, or you can do things like planting trees in the right place, whether that be things like persimmons or plums, other soft mass producing trees, getting those in areas that they'll actually thrive. That's the other thing that you can do. If you're talking about vegetative production, right? So some of the other forest practices that we would use that aren't necessarily logging, to increase food availability at the forest floor, especially in stands that are older, can be removing trees at the mid-story to try to get more light that comes down at a localized level. It could be removing trees that have lower economic value that are taking up larger components of the canopy that don't allow the light to come down. Or it could be doing things like removing trees that you have in the mid-story that aren't necessarily the preferred species for certain goals. And you can do what's called a hinge cut or a live felling, where you're cutting with a chainsaw at chest height. You don't cut all the way through, but you cut to where it only has a little bit left and you push it over. That takes the structure that was 20 feet up, puts it on the ground. So you now have cover on the ground and browse and vegetation. And then the tree is not going to die instantaneously. It's going to throw off all these stress sprouts that are also really highly nutritious. Other common practices to increase food include crop tree release, the low thinning to try to promote more growth underneath and get certain species down there. Removing trees that you don't want in the canopy, which we talked about already, and then the invasive species to reduce competition and also promote what you do want to grow. The crop tree release side is all about usually benefiting an individual tree by reducing its competition. And you can do that in a couple different ways where you're doing a full release of that tree, right? So you have, say, this green tree is a nice white oak that you think has a lot of potential to expand and grow. But maybe it's surrounded by some maples. You can go in and say, well, I can either kind of do a one tree release or a one-sided release all the way up to a complete release, where you're removing those trees that are directly touching the canopy, and create a gap up there that target tree that you want to release will then grow into, allowing it to get more sunlight, produce more nutrients, and then hopefully from the wildlife side, potentially drop more mass to the ground in the future. From the economic side, it usually means that they'll have a burst of growth and potentially have more board feet to harvest in the long run. Other techniques that we see used, especially on the wildlife side, not as common on the forestry side, are things like manipulating the edge of a forest to create early successional habitat, not necessarily at large scale, but along features, to make that transition from, say, a field or a pasture to a forest a little bit nicer for many species, and putting a lot more vegetation close to the ground, where light exists. And also it's an area where you get a lot of soft mass production for many species, whether it be things like elderberry or dogwoods. They're going to do a lot better in these areas than, say, in the middle of the forest itself. And you're not giving up a lot of your forest by size and acreage. Usually it's just the first 10 to 30 meters in. You can go a little further than that if you want, and you kind of reduce the forest in stages. You can use some of your stand improvements in ways that help promote cover, especially short term before you get that vegetative response. Say you have removed some pines, you can actually build wildlife brush piles. This is something you can do in your backyard with a Christmas tree you have left over. And all you're really doing is creating a temporary cover feature that animals can use, especially things like birds and small mammals, that kind of takes up and provides thermal and escape cover in an area that hasn't had a chance to vegetatively respond yet. The snag part is an interesting one because a lot of times when we do things like FSI or even crop tree release, you can create snags. And snags are just the dead or dying tree that has features and progresses in a fashion that creates wildlife habitat for certain species as it progresses. We always want some in the forest, usually about 1 to 2 an acre is a sufficient number to meet our species needs that we have. But not all snags are created equal. Certain ones, as they progress, are going to gain more value for certain species than others. Usually, we want some in that 2 to 5 range that's going to meet a lot more species needs. So we have this classification system, right? And it's kind of how a tree dies and then what does it do as it decomposes. And once it hits a certain point, it falls over and becomes, coarse woody debris on the ground, which is also really important, especially for species like salamanders and other herps. So creating snags kind of works its way through the system as a benefit. It can also have a forestry benefit. You don't obviously want to go out and just kill a whole bunch of trees without thinking about where those trees are and how they're going to play out, but it is a good thing to have. And, just like tree succession and how species kind of play out in forests and plant succession, there are different species that use different stages of decay on those snags along the way. So you kind of need to be thinking about that as you're managing for wildlife and utilizing this practice. Um, Often we're doing this with herbicides or girdling trees. The good thing is usually you can kind of, meet need either way. It depends on what your preference is. It's a lot easier to girdle a larger tree and a lot more cost efficient, whereas a lot easier to use herbicide on smaller trees to create those snags. Um, Either way, it's going to create food and cover, right? So you get insects that are helping kind of that decay process that are really great for things like birds and bats. Or as it falls to the ground, right, and hits the ground, then you have things like bears and small mammals that are using those insects. And it's also creating that cover. As we move forward, I'll kind of wrap this up here a little bit. You have a lot of different practices that play a role that are often utilized in forestry. Most of them are going to kind of take what we have and manipulate that vegetation in a fashion that's going to meet whatever goals you have for whatever species you're managing for. Not once in here did you hear me talk about a forestry practice that has no benefit to wildlife whatsoever. That change that's occurring in a forest is going to benefit a certain species one way or another. That habitat not being destroyed or created, just changing form, means there are species throughout the entire mix that are going to benefit. Even if you put a road over top of all those trees, there are species that we commonly see use roads and benefit from them. Whether or not that's a good idea at scale or not, different discussion, but it just something that happens, right? We have geese that are utilizing the roofs of our hospital over here for nesting habitat. So it kind of there's not a lot of bad out there in terms of forestry practices. There are practices that do not benefit certain species, just like there are practices that benefit species. So having that forester involved, having that wildlife biologist involved, helping you make those decisions really is an important part of this context. You can go from this to this and have a huge benefit. And you can go from that to that and then manipulate it by adding things like fire as a secondary disturbance and get a different outcome than not having fire on the landscape. So you can stack these practices to get changes that you want in vegetative communities and vegetative structure. Or, you can just have the harvest and let it go and it'll benefit certain species. So the big thing here, take home, if you're managing wildlife for your property, having forestry involved, it's all going to depend on what species you want to promote. And the big thing here is having diversity of forest stages is going to be really important to benefiting the most number of wildlife. Having that early succession, having that mid successional forest to that old growth, having a little bit of that around whether you meet it all on your property or is met in the grander scheme of the landscape, is all a good thing. Logging and all the practices that go along with logging and managing your forests are, if you're following best management practices, following those labeled guidelines and herbicides and everything else, you're not going to screw things up to a point where it's not going to help wildlife species of some kind or another. You can cause problems in terms of meeting your goals if you don't do things properly, but it's not going to necessarily cause a huge issue. Not unless you're not following that label and you pour a whole bunch of herbicides into a river system. That would be a huge screw up, but you're not following the actual law. So if you're following the regulations and all the science that goes behind it, we know that it's going to have a positive outcome for certain species. And if you are managing your forest and doing things like try to keep invasives out or any of that, if it's under management and under a management plan, you are probably benefiting wildlife in some way, shape, or form, even if it's not your goal. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you. We really appreciate that. It was a great presentation. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Really, you covered a lot of ground.
You
Solid.
really did.
That was great.
Yeah. Let's see, we didn't have any questions. We had some people asking like, what does like BMPs or TSI mean? So
We covered them. We covered them though. Yeah.
Yeah. So BMPs being best management practices and guidelines that were developed using science to help, say, our master loggers, right, are going to follow best management practices for all the logging, especially associated and around streams or drainages, to ensure that sediment's not getting in the system and runoff's not going to become a problem in the grand scheme of things. Just as one example, there's a lot of others as well. So. Yeah, those acronyms, there's just everywhere.
There's a lot of them, yeah.
And there's tons.
Yeah, unfortunately. But well, Dr. Springer, I really appreciated your comments today and your presentation. I mean, again, we can make these things work together, right? We can make growing high quality timber and having wildlife abundance, happen together. Working with professionals is a key, right? And you said that, right? Each landscape is unique in its own setting. So, it was a great presentation. Really appreciate you on that.
So we did get one question that just came in. Does Kentucky have any grants to help landowners plan and manage forests?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do.
I'd be happy to talk to you separate about that. Or you could talk to your forester. You can talk to the Kentucky Division of Forestry, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, local NRCS office. Each one of those can help you get signed up for a management plan. So if you have any other questions about that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to make those connections for you.
Oh, wonderful.
Then I just saw the other comment about a lot for 30 plus acres, not sure about for less. And that does play a role in the process for sure.
It does. Yep. And I would say, so if you've got less than 10 acres, the Kentucky Division of Forestry can supply a management plan. It's like a practice plan to do specific thing. It won't be like a full blown forest management plan, but if you have more than 10 acres, then that makes you eligible for the forest stewardship program. And that's more of a full blown management plan. Typically, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources look at about 20, 25 acres as a minimum threshold, but they can still be consulted via phone and email for additional information. NRCS does not have any acreage limits, but you still have to be competitive enough to qualify for those. So not having a lot of acreage may make you not as competitive, but technically there is no acreage limitation. Hopefully that helps, folks.
Billy?
No, they have to be under one ownership. Certainly you can combine your management, and that's really smart, right? I mean, if you're treating invasive plants and your neighbor's not, guess what? Your work's going to be a lot harder. So, I would say that, and reaching out to those professionals and let them know that you all maybe are, joining forces and you're kind of managing that as a whole property, that might provide some additional insights and opportunities for both you all.
Definitely. Thank you, Dr. Springer. We really appreciate you being here.
That was really good.
It was
Matt.
awesome.
You really did a good job on that.
You did a great job. Thank you so much.
Yep. Good stuff.
So, speaking of good jobs.
No, I love it.
Ellen, woohoo!
Hello, how's it going, everybody? Happy New Year.
Thank you, Dr. Crocker, for being here and giving us some updates on some invasive plants that we have creepy crawling around.
Ooh, Well, there's always invasive plants to discuss, unfortunately, and they can really impact your management in a lot of the ways that Dr. Springer
Yeah.
was just talking about. You get some invasives in there and they can throw you for a loop for sure.
Right.
So, since it's January and it's our
Mhm.
first show of the year, I decided to go with a pesky plant
Okay.
that you can still find this time of year.
All
It's still
right.
Oh,
visible.
really?
Makes it a
Yeah,
little easier on everybody. Thank you. Yeah.
a
Everything
little
else is pretty
easier.
much dead, and this one's not. Is that the case?
Exactly. It's
Okay.
everything has lost their leaves. This one still has it. Plus, we are in like the best window for management for this plant right now.
Okay.
So I want to get it on people's radar early in this year because if you're looking at this beautiful warm weather that we're having, sometimes in the winter it's really cold and snowy and it's a different story. But if we're having a nice warm winter and you happen to have winter creeper in your woods, in your landscape, January can be a really good time for some foliar herbicide spray for some management, and we'll talk a little bit more about it.
Looking
Awesome.
forward
Well,
to
I
it.
look for it. Thank you, Dr. Crocker.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. And, as much as I love telling you all about the invasive plants and the pesky plants that are out there, my goal today isn't to scare you about the terrible invasives out and about, but hopefully to give you some ideas about how you can be addressing this issue if you don't have it yet, how to scout for it, and if you do have it, how to get a better grasp on management in light of it. So, for today's pesky plants, we're going to be talking about Wintercreeper. Wintercreeper is a popular ornamental ground cover and it has glossy evergreen leaves, so no wonder people like to plant it in their homes and gardens. But this plant can spread out of those yards and invade natural areas, causing big problems in forests. So, in this edition of Pesky Plants, we're going to learn a little bit about winter creeper, how to identify it, how to manage it, and what you can be doing. So, what is winter creeper? Here you can see a picture of some small little trees growing up through a sea of winter creeper. It is an evergreen vine that can grow in different forms. So in this picture, you see it growing, creeping along the ground, forming this really dense mat that excludes other plants. But you can also find it growing up trees as a vine, and you can also see it growing in more of like a shrub-like form, especially if it's growing over a fence or some kind of downed log. So it can be deceiving in terms of looking really different, and the leaves might look a little bit different depending on if it's growing up a tree or carpeting the ground. It's originally native to Asia, and it was introduced here in large part because of its aesthetic value. That ornamental, evergreen, dense ground cover is something that a lot of people want in their landscaping. And you can find lots of different cultivars that are sold of winter creeper. Euonymus fortunii, as well as other similar euonymus species. But they don't stay put. So if you have planted this in your yard, you know all too well you regret that decision because it takes over. And even just from a garden perspective, can be a real nuisance and does not play well with others and is hard to remove. But it also produces little fruits that are eaten by birds and other animals and can be spread to new locations. Um, an interesting fact about winter creeper is that there has been research done to look at these different cultivars and try to figure out what's going on with the winter creeper that's out in our natural areas. And it pretty much all traces to this one cultivar, coloratus, which is purple leafed cultivar. And you can still find these cultivars for sale. So save your money and plant something else because if you plant it, you might end up with a situation like this, where you have a sea of winter creeper in this woods. It's carpeting the ground. That's going to prevent diversity of wildflowers. It's going to prevent seedlings from growing into saplings, growing into big trees in the future. It's going to climb up the trees that are there and can cause problems with that as well. So increasing the chance of wind throw, potentially overtopping them in the canopy and causing other problems. So I'd say it as a vine, it's really causing that damage to those individual trees, making them more susceptible to other damage, whether it's from ice storms or windstorms. As a ground cover, this is where I think of its biggest ecological damage. Like it's just forming this dense mat of nothing but winter creeper. You will commonly see it in urban parks and forested areas after disturbance, in kind of more degraded woodlands that have had a lot of things going on there. And it is extremely common in many different areas. So another situation that I have seen is that winter creeper takes advantage of removing other invasive plants. So let's say you removed all of your bush honeysuckle and we're feeling really good about that, but there was winter creeper just waiting to take off underneath that really took advantage of that new scenario. So, in terms of identifying winter creeper, here are some tips. The leaves are opposite each other. So here you can see this is like a shoot that's growing. It's carpeting the ground, but it's really growing as a vine as it's doing so with these shoots. And it is making leaves that are opposite each other on the stem. Those leaves are dark green on the top and a lighter green on the underside with a really thick texture and can be glossy on the top. The edges are just going to be a tiny bit toothed there as well. And the growth form is going to vary, so it depends on if it's carpeting the ground like this. You can see here it's this really bright green with some lighter green veins. When it's growing in kind of along the ground, those leaves tend to be smaller and glossier. But when it grows up a tree like this as a vine, those leaves tend to be a little bit bigger. And in the wintertime, these leaves are likely to turn more of a reddish purplish color. And it's only going to produce flowers and berries when it's growing up as a vine like this. So you're not going to see that when it's growing as a ground cover. But when it's growing up as a vine like this, you might see some flowers. You might see these fruits that develop from those. The flowers aren't very distinctive. They're kind of this light yellow, pale green color, but they develop into these fruits that kind of crack open, revealing this orange, fleshy interior fruit that will burst out of it and leave this kind of little papery covering. So that's some identification for winter creeper, but there are some lookalikes, both lookalikes that you also may want to get rid of, as well as some native species that might not be as high a priority there. So there are other evergreen invasive vines that might spread from your garden into your woods. And one example of that is English ivy. So used really similar to winter creeper in a lot of landscaping settings, carpeting the ground. It can spread from there and can be really difficult to control. And this is another species that, in this picture here, you can see where I found it taking over in the woods. So it might have started in someone's garden, but now it's climbing up these trees and it's carpeting the ground and causing really similar problems. There are other invasive species that might be used ornamentally as ground covers, like this vinca, that can do the same thing, kind of cause problems in woods and other natural areas by taking over and forming dense mats. So just because you like it and it looks pretty in your garden does not mean that it's going to play nice in once it escapes from there and gets out into nature. We also have both vinca and English ivy are non-native species and are broadly considered invasive, but there are some native vines that can take over and grow up trees and carpet the ground, things like Virginia creeper and poison ivy. And while you might not like poison ivy for a bunch of reasons, you might get rid of it when it's growing near your house. I certainly do. It's less likely to cause the same broad scale problems as some of our invasive species. And these are species that have been in these woods for a long time. It's kind of not a new player, but something that's just part of the system. Now, Wintercreeper is in the euonymus genus, and there are several native and non-native species in that same genus that you might find. One of the non-native species that you would like to avoid, it's considered invasive as well as a popular ornamental, is burning bush. So while burning bush has a really different form from Wintercreeper, it's growing as a shrub, not as a vine or ground cover. It's a pretty close relative, and so you can see some overlaps in terms of their leaves are opposite each other. They have a similar form, but burning bush, like Wintercreeper, is a popular ornamental plant. You can still find it for sale. That same ornamental plant produces seeds which can spread into natural areas. And from there, it looks really different than it does kind of as this compact, really bright fall color plant in your yard. It gets longer and lankier and kind of looks like bush honeysuckle or something else, but it can take over and cause problems too. Not something you want. We also have some native euonymus species that I always get excited when I find. And so things like wahoo or strawberry bush, they have similar types of fruits and leaf arrangement. So just wanted to put that out there that there are other related euonymus species that are native to their area. I don't think you'd easily confuse them with Wintercreeper, but still wanted to put them on your radar. They're not vining, they're shrubs, but nonetheless a fun thing to find. So management of Wintercreeper. As with any invasive plant, managing Wintercreeper is going to take patience and persistence. And I recommend that folks start small. So don't try to do everything everywhere, but focus on an area, a smaller area, and really pick your battles in terms of think about where you want to be doing the most work and have success there before moving on. Your management for Wintercreeper is really going to depend on how much area is impacted. Is this kind of all over your yard? Is this just in a tiny little area? Is it a few acres? Is it 15 acres? That's a different management approach. So for vines growing up trees, because it only produces flowers and seeds when it's growing up a tree as a vine, this is typically the first stage to cut and target in your management so you can at least prevent that. And you don't need to pull the vines out of the tree. That can actually do more damage than good. You just need to sever where they're kind of growing, take a chunk out of that vine stem so that the Wintercreeper isn't going to be able to continue growing up. It doesn't kill it, the roots are still there, but at least it's not growing up into your tree and producing lots more seeds. And also, if you do pull it up, if you are doing this, don't pull it because you might accidentally pull something onto you and hurt yourself. So here's a past student of mine. You can see he's kind of carefully cutting those vines as they're growing up a tree. In this case, they're pretty small, so he's just using just some clippers. For bigger vines, you may want to use a saw, but be careful not to damage the tree. Now, for it growing as a ground cover, you can hand pull it. You can certainly pull it up either by hand or with tools. You can manage it with repeated cutting or grazing. You can mulch it. You can solarize small patches, covering them to kill what's underneath. Now, the mulching and the solarizing will kill it. If you're doing mowing or grazing, that doesn't kill the root system. It's going to come back, but you can really push it back. But because of the matting nature of it, it can require a lot of work because it might just send out more. And so that might be a better first step than a final step. And so just to give you an idea of this is an area that some of my students were working in. And so this is a patch totally covered with Wintercreeper. They removed it. And you can see them raking it up and taking it out. They pulled it out of the site because if you leave it there, it might re-root. I don't think it would do that if you were just mowing it there, but certainly something you don't want to risk happening. But this took a long time and was a lot of work. and is not something you're going to want to do when the seeds are out either. And it doesn't kill the root system. So frequently this would be combined with herbicide application. So here's me doing a foliar herbicide application of Wintercreeper. And this would be probably a better approach if you have lots of acres, a large infestation, and that systemic herbicide will kill the root system. Foliar herbicide is a challenge on Wintercreeper because of its waxy leaves, but if you use a seed oil and a surfactant, you can overcome this. So here's a quick photo of a site that I was working in where we used a 3% triclopyr herbicide mixed with methylated seed oil and non-ionic surfactant. And you can see here's where it was most recently treated. Here's where we treated it a couple years ago. This was all a blanket of Wintercreeper before that. And here's what hasn't been treated. And here you can see the trilliums are making their way up through what would have been this dense blanket of Wintercreeper before, and very good damage to the Wintercreeper without harming other things. And one of the keys to doing that is that you can take advantage of its evergreen leaves. So since Wintercreeper has its leaves in the winter and everything else that's native pretty much has lost them in our area, you can do that foliar herbicide application if the weather's warm enough in those winter months when you really can target the Wintercreeper but not have negative impacts to the things you want to keep. In the long term, you're going to need to continue scouting and managing that because new seeds are going to arrive, new shoots are going to come up. So just something to keep in mind. It's never going to be over, but you can make a huge impact. And it's really encouraging for me to see things like those trilliums coming up just within a few years after that initial management. Another thing I want to say is that because Wintercreeper is still broadly sold, don't plant it. Keep in mind that that same Wintercreeper you might be purchasing could get out of control. So when you're out there shopping, make sure you're picking some non-invasive alternatives, whether it's as a ground cover, something like this wild ginger, if you're looking for a vine, one of our beautiful native vine species, so that you're not regretting your decisions later. So with that, thanks for joining me and learning a little bit more about Wintercreeper. And if you want to learn more, we've got a fact sheet available you can check out online. And I wish you the best in fighting invasive plants and promoting the health and diversity of your native plant communities.
Well, thank you, Dr. Crocker. We really appreciated your presentation, and we did have some question. If you spray Wintercreeper and other invasives with herbicides, then wildlife eat the berries. Will that harm them?
Well, I've only sprayed the ground cover carpeting one in order to get to the part that has the berries on it. Just logistically, that's probably not relevant in this situation. And
Mhm.
also, I'd really recommend that people pick this time of year to do that. It's just very convenient. In terms of the impact of those herbicides on animals, I think you should follow the label. Always follow that label. The label is the law, but it's also how we keep ourselves safe and how we keep the environment safe.
Yep.
Yeah. I did text Dr. Springer about it because I knew he had to hop off. And he said you have a short window where that could be an issue, balance between risk and reward. So,
And different herbicides are going to have different windows for that. So
Mhm.
definitely, I recommend you check that out and follow the instructions.
Definitely. Always good to follow
Yeah.
instructions.
We had another question, Dr. Crocker. If you mow the winter creeper, does it spread it?
I don't think it will. Now, if it was producing seed, then I don't think it would be there. So I don't think it would be an issue. But with a lot of invasives, you do want to avoid mowing it when it's producing seed. That's a major issue. To my knowledge, I don't think it would root terribly well from small fragments of it. That's always a concern too, though. So something to look for and make sure that's not happening. But I don't think that would be a serious issue.
Well, it's certainly going to be something you're going to have to look at for a few years, right? So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'll put the link to that fact sheet in the chat. I saw somebody just asked about that.
Awesome.
I was trying to find it real quick, but I was like,
Like, I
Oh,
know I've got it here somewhere.
oh, great presentation. Really give folks a lot to think about and encourage them to get out there and kind of, treat their woods now when they can. So,
Mhm.
Yeah, we're in a good window for that. So if this is something that you're interested, consider that winter time when other things we don't care about don't have their leaves on. Winter creeper does. It's a great time for scouting for winter creeper. It's a great time for pulling it up, for removing it, for a foliar herbicide spray, all of the above.
Excellent.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you
All
so
right.
very much,
Thank you
Dr.
again, Dr.
Crocker.
Crocker. A great
Thank
start to
you.
the new year. I'm glad you're here with us
Thanks.
for sure. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. All right. Well, thank you
Great
all
program.
so
Yeah.
much. It was a great program, but again, it wouldn't be it without you. So you're the reason why we're doing this. So we appreciate you being so much and joining us on this first edition of From the Woods Today in 2026. Next week, Billy, we're going to be talking about tree pruning. So people want to, that's our main topic. So they'll want to check that out for sure. And I just wanted to let people know
Sure.
what next week's topic is going to be. I'm trying to be better about that.
No, no, you're great. You're great. No, I would say, folks, join us every week. We're going to have some great speakers throughout 26, and let us know if there's some things that you need to learn about. If you're
Definitely.
dealing with it, others probably are as well. So we want to help all of our folks out there be good stewards of our woods and wildlife and all our natural resources. So you all are going a long way in doing that by being part of the show. So we really do appreciate you. And, let us know if we can support you anyway. We'll try to make connections and help you all get going, get management if you're not. But I'm glad to have you all with us this year, and let's have a great 2026.
Again, take care, and we appreciate you joining us, and we will see you all next week.
All right. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
From the woods today. From the woods today.